So you're probably excited to dive in to your study of the New Testament. You've worked your way through, what was it, 1,184 pages of the Old Testament, and now you turn that page over, and there it is, the Gospel according to St. Matthew, and you've got this new resolve, I'm going to study the New Testament. And you jump in, and in the first 16 verses, Matthew begins with a long list of so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so. It's a long genealogy list. And many of you are probably thinking, oh, this is so boring. But this isn't boring if you consider who's writing, what his audience is, and what his purpose is in writing his gospel. Matthew, as one of the disciples of Christ, one of his 12 apostles, he is paying very close attention to this level of detail to try to convince these Jewish people that he's writing to, as well as probably some Gentile converts in the mix down the road, that Jesus is the Christ. So how's he going to do that? It's by connecting the Savior with all of the people and all of the promises from the Old Testament that run very deep in their Jewish culture.
If you look carefully, there's a couple of interesting things going on right here, even in the very first verse. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ. So in the Greek, the word generation is Genesis. So Matthew is very purposely trying to echo the idea that this is a new Genesis, a new creation, that God is once again working his love and his order in the world. And notice these key characters that Matthew connects Jesus Christ to. That Jesus Christ is the son of David, the great beloved king of united Israel, the son of Abraham, who is the progenitor of all the faithful. Abraham, the one who received this great eternal promise from God, that God would give posterity and prosperity to. So very fascinating that Matthew takes the time to say, these are the two of the most important characters from the ancient Israelite history, and look at how Jesus is connected to them. So that's just the opening verse.
And we would add one more, even though it's not in the opening verse, we would add one more character from the Old Testament that Matthew is going to be kind of painting this picture over and over again, how Jesus Christ is a new Moses, the lawgiver, the one who is the famous prophet from the Old Testament. So you get the famous patriarch, father of all the faithful, the most famous king, and the most famous lawgiver, all encapsulated in one, in a renewed fulfillment of all Old Testament prophecy embodied in Jesus Christ. So he opens up his gospel with these connections here. And you'll notice he uses a very interesting technique. So he begins with Abraham, and he goes down through 14 generations between Abraham down to David. So, in fact, let me do it this way. So we're going to start with Abraham here, then you get 14 generations before you get to King David. So Abraham being a direct ancestor for their favorite king of all. And then you're going to get 14 generations down to the exile in Babylon when the kingdom was lost to the Babylonians. And then they come back from exile, and you're going to get 14 more generations before you enter on the stage of history, Jesus the Christ. And you'll notice he begins with the given name and the main title, the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah. So it's all here on this first chapter. But did you notice something fascinating?
I was going to ask about this. What's significant about 14 3 different times?
So this is an ancient literary technique. Actually, it's not a literary technique. It's just an ancient practice called gematria, where you would take your name in Hebrew, and each letter of your name would have a number value attached to it. And if you take all the letters of your name and take their number values and add them together, everybody's name would have a number value. Well, the number 14, if we were to get into a time machine and go back to the first century, to Jerusalem or Galilee, and walk up to somebody and say, hey, I've got a question for you. I'm new here, and I hear people talking about 14. Who is number 14? I think most of them would look at you and think, this is obvious. This is our favorite king of all time. What happens is you take these letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and you have Dalet, and then you have Vav, and then you have Dalet. Well, and you're reading from right to left. Dalet happens to be the 4th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Vav happens to be the 6th letter of the alphabet. So if you add 6 plus 4, that's 10 plus 4 equals 14. Dalet is the equivalent of our D, Vav is our V, and D, it's David, it's King David. The number 14 is David. So what Matthew just did is he took this genealogy chart and he forced it into 14 generations multiplied by 3, but he's clearly skipping people. Because we're covering 750 years from here to here. You're not going to cover 750 years with only 14 father-son pairs. And in the second one, you're covering 400 years. And in the third one, you're covering 600 years. And by the way, one of the copyists clearly missed one of the names because you've only got 13 there. But you'll notice when he says, in verse 17, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David unto the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. So Matthew's he didn't just do it and then leave you open to figure it out. He says, I did it, now look what I did. His message is a superlative statement that Jesus Christ is the Son of David, the Son of David, the Son of David. Why would he be making such a big deal that the Messiah, the Christ, needed to be a son of David?
There seems to be some sense that the number 3 meant covenantal in the ancient Jewish thinking. And so not only is Jesus a Messiah figure, let's pause there for a moment. You might remember in the ancient world, the ancient Israelites, kings were anointed, prophets were anointed, priests were anointed. So Jesus is this anointed kingly character, David, but triplicate 3 times. He is the covenantal king, the promised king. And that is significant. So his Jewish readers, the readers of Matthew, and primarily actually would have been listeners originally, would have absolutely known, like, oh, as an opening thesis statement, it is unmistakable what you're trying to communicate to us, Matthew, that you're going to tell us a whole story. And the entire focus is about who the real anointed king of Israel is. And remember, anciently, they believe it was the king's duty to save the people and to establish peace and prosperity.
So keep that word in mind, to save. That'll come up later in the lesson. The other fascinating factor here is that Matthew isn't writing his story or his gospel in real time. It seems that this is written after, we don't know how many years after, 15, 20, 25 years after the Savior's crucifixion and resurrection and ascension into heaven. And so now you get this, the world of the book of Acts, where the gospel is spreading forth and you're bringing in Gentile converts, you're bringing in Jewish converts, and they're having conflicts in those later years after the Savior's ascension, where they're trying to figure out what do you need to do to be a good member of this Christian congregation if you're a Gentile? Is there room for you without first becoming a Jewish proselyte and living all the law of Moses first? And there are a lot of those debates raging, which adds an interesting caveat here to this long list of genealogy names, because Matthew chooses to insert 5 women into this long list of men in these 14, 14, 14 generations. And you'll notice the women that he includes in every single case are women that would be considered not on the inside of a Jewish congregation in the first century. The first one is in verse 3, Tamar. Many of you will remember the story of Judah and Tamar from the Old Testament in the book of Genesis. That was not a great story, but Matthew includes her in this genealogy list as a progenitor of Christ. The next two are in verse 5, Booz and Rahab. So that's Rahab. She's the harlot, or the innkeeper, however you want to interpret that Hebrew word, in Jericho, who is not a descendant of the house of Israel. She's an outsider. She's what you would call a Gentile to them. And then Ruth, who marries Boaz, and Ruth is a Moabitess. She's not in the house of Israel. And then you get King David in verse 6, begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So King David, after having his issues with Bathsheba, they lose the first child, and then the second child here is Solomon, who's now in this genealogy list. But are you noticing it's either through adultery or through marrying somebody who's not in the Abrahamic family or in the house of Israel would be a more appropriate way to word that, not of the tribes of Israel. And Matthew's including these women in the list. And then your fifth woman, obviously, is over in verse 16. It's Mary herself, who was found with child outside of wedlock. So in every case, it's almost as if Matthew's signaling we're being collectively a way too judgmental on people, and God can do his work through all kinds of people, and his invitation is for the gospel to go to all the world. And one of the core elements of the Abrahamic covenant is that it would bless every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And yet at the time of Christ and in the first century, the people surrounding this story, they want to stay pretty insular. They want to stay pretty exclusive and not share any of the messages. So I love the fact that Matthew, one of the apostles of the Lord, when he's sharing the genealogy, he's including some people that would have made some of those Jewish people in the first century squirm a little bit in their seats as they hear him describing this list.
And it also addresses the question, how could you believe in a man like Jesus of divine origin when he came from a woman who was found pregnant, not being married? There's a problem there. In many cultures throughout the world, when children have been born of a woman who's not married, it often has been seen as a negative thing, or there's been negative thoughts about that woman. And Matthew's trying to say, God is at work here. And you need to see that God is working with his chosen vessel, Mary, just like he did with these 4 other women that show up in this genealogy, that God can do his work. And sometimes we have cultural expectations that get violated by how life plays out. And Matthew's helping us to see that God has a larger plan and purpose, and God is in the details. And I find that super compelling.
So if you're looking carefully in verse 16, you'll notice that what Matthew gave you was Joseph's genealogy, not Mary's. Look at how he words it in 16. And Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary. So this long genealogy list you've been reading, it's Joseph's genealogy chart. And then it says at the very end that Joseph is the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus is born, who is called the Christ. And some would say, well, wait a minute, Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus, so why would we care about Joseph's genealogy? And the answer is, you may not care, but in the first century, those Jewish people cared a great deal about the male genealogy line, because Joseph is commanded in chapter 1 to adopt Jesus. and to name him, which is the sign that, yep, he is the legal father of this baby moving forward, which means Jesus now, being adopted by Joseph, inherits Joseph's genealogy. His earthly pedigree chart becomes shared with Jesus. And what's more, in Luke, you're going to see another pedigree chart later on. And you'll see that Joseph and Mary, tradition is that they're pretty close relatives. So you don't have to get too far up this line before these two pedigree charts merge. But the significance of this is Jesus needed to be adopted. And that's what chapter 1 is all about, is Matthew showing us how the birth of Jesus works from the man's side, from Joseph's perspective. And you'll notice when we get to Luke, Luke is going to tell you about the birth of Jesus from the woman's side, from Mary's perspective, and from other people in their culture who could very easily be overlooked or kept in the margins and not paid any attention to. Luke will highlight those, whereas Matthew is going to go to the center of a Jewish perspective and a Jewish culture and highlight the story of Joseph and King Herod in chapter 2 and the wise men, all the things that Jewish men would have found very compelling and very interesting.
I love this story for a lot of reasons. One of them is my wife and I could not have our own children, and through the gift and miracle of adoption, there were 4 birth parents who entrusted their children to us, an absolute miracle and gift that we see every day. And we tell our kids, you're like Jesus. You've been adopted. You're loved by a lot of people. You're loved by your heavenly parents. You're loved by your birth parents. You're loved by us. And I love here for a culture, a Jewish culture that cared deeply, generally speaking, about children being born to married individuals, that God can do his work even when things don't always work out according to cultural expectations. Matthew helps us to see there is a divine plan at work. God will do his work despite what anybody else may try to do. So this is a beautiful message that here's Joseph, who's willing to adopt a son that is not technically his, but Joseph serves as the earthly father and loves Jesus as a real father would love his own son.
So now that we've laid out the kind of Matthew's foundation, his first, what would be piece of evidence to say, pay attention, Jesus is the Christ. He's the son of Abraham. He's the son of David. He's the superlative son of David, because those Old Testament prophecies in the first century, they're holding on to those. Their deliverer, their Messiah, is going to restore the kingdom to the house of Judah through the loins of David. He will be a son of David who is the coming Messiah. And that's exactly what Matthew laid that foundation for.